Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, Executive Director for Policy and Governance, and I'm joined today by Deborah Evans, LLG's very own CEO.
Well, hello everybody out there, and what a busy week it's been again in the world of local government, particularly for us as we've had our governance conference running over the past 2 weeks, which has given us an ideal opportunity to explore some of the biggest issues that are facing local government today. So Helen, where are you starting?
Well, Deborah, Lord Cameron, a cabinet reshuffle, the Supreme Court decision on the application of AAA Syria, and that was in respect to the Rwandan immigration policy, of course, and tax cut speculation in light of the autumn statement later this week. It's certainly never a dull moment. But what about local government, Deborah?
Well, unfortunately, the quick summary seems to be that it's running out of money. And some of you will have picked up in the news this week that Nottingham Council is now in a difficult position, and it has a significant gap in its authority's budget for this year in the region, I think, of about £23 million. Now, I know that potentially, obviously, they're not the only council. We heard recently from Birmingham and the issues they're having with funding equal pay claims, etc. But this is again driven by something that many councils are seeing around an increased demand for children and adult social care, rising homelessness, and also the impact of inflation, cost of living rises that we're all having to face, councils as much as anybody. Now, this council fortunately is not bankrupt or insolvent, and it does have sufficient financial resources to meet all of its current obligations, pay staff, suppliers, and people who receive grants, etc. So that there's no cause for massive alarm here. However, because of this forecasted overspend, which is quite significant, the Section 151 officer is considering appropriate next steps for the authority, which includes basically assessing whether it can deliver a balanced budget for next year. So it goes without saying that they will be considering issuing a Section 114 report, something that's very topical at the moment. And if that does happen, then obviously the council will consider the report within 21 days and then move forward from there. So that with it will bring about spending controls, which would obviously need to be tightened. And then you have that whole practical impact where if you haven't got spending that's contractually committed or needed for statutory duties, then that spending tends to be stopped. So the issuing of a Section 114 notice obviously is a very significant one for a council, and a decision that they take very carefully indeed. So Helen, I'm really interested in your view. Is this lack of funding a local issue that we're now just seeing in councils here and there, or is this a bigger concern for the sector?
Well, Deborah, it's got to be a bigger concern, hasn't it? And we can see this evidenced if we take a look at the LGA's submission on the autumn statement to the government. This is taken from the LGA bulletin. The Chancellor always receives in advance of the autumn statement a position from the LGA, and in it they highlight their analysis, which shows that councils are facing funding gaps of 2.4 billion in 23-24 and 1.6 billion in 24-25. And they highlight that these gaps relate solely to the funding needed just to maintain services at their current levels. So the funding gap in 23-24, the LLGA says, is equivalent to councils stopping all spending on waste collection, library services, and recreation and sports combined. And that's quite alarming for the sector, Deborah. Covering 4 areas of local government service, the LGA particularly highlights that the number of children in care is now at its highest since current records began, which was in 1994. It stands at over 82,000. Expenditure on fostering and residential placements increased by 39.6% in cash terms from 2016 and 17 to 2021-22, and that went to 3.8 billion. Now, councils are supporting ever-increasing numbers of unoccupied asylum-seeking children and care leavers, with Home Office funding for these placements failing to fully cover costs. There's pressure in children's social care, which is leading to children's social workers leaving council work or leaving the profession altogether. And the care review highlights that the additional cost of employing agency staff is approximately £26,000 per worker per year, which basically means a loss of £100 million per year from children's social care services. And that's at a time where they can ill afford any losses. You've got dedicated schools grant and high needs funding pressures, which are one of the biggest challenges that councils with education responsibilities are currently facing. The Department for Education statistics show that as of January 2023, there were over 517,000 children with an ECHP, which is an increase of 9% from 2022. And we know, of course, there are many children on waiting lists waiting for those assessments. So the additional funding made available in the 2022 autumn statement for adult social care, the LGA says was helpful, but much of the funding will now be absorbed by meeting pay and inflationary pressures. And that member councils have raised significant concerns about frozen local housing allowance rates. So the rising cost of living, the closure of Afghan bridging hotels, wider asylum and resettlement pressures, and an insufficient supply of affordable housing all are combining to driving increases in homelessness and therefore reducing councils' ability as well to source suitable accommodation. It paints a concerning picture. We'll have to see how the government responds within its autumn statement this week. Deborah.
Well, it's almost like a perfect storm of everything conspiring against being able to deliver a good quality of services within a balanced budget. So it's very concerning indeed. And it's important to remember really that a lot of those services that were on the list that you said that people basically couldn't afford are what communities really value. Things like the sports halls, the libraries, the parks, never mind the waste collection. I mean, these are essential to the fabric of our communities, and they support health and well-being proactively rather than then reactively, which obviously the reactive support then comes as a great cost to society as well. So what particularly concerns me is that this lack of funding may impact on the progress of local authorities towards net zero and impact on their ability to undertake activities that will prevent further damage through climate change, which is a shame because there's been some really positive news from a number of local authorities recently. So, for example, Warwickshire County Council has been rated amongst the top local authorities for sustainability by the West Midlands Local Authority Sustainability Benchmark 2023. Now, this is published on behalf of the Environment Agency and looks at actions taken in detail across the sustainability agenda. Now, overall, the council was awarded a score of 68.8%, which was an increase on previous year and put it 7th in the 20 regional authorities that took part. Leeds City Council has been recognised as one of the 119 cities across the globe taking bold leadership on environmental action and transparency, despite all of these pressures that you talked about from a funding perspective. Now, this list has come out by the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is an international authority, and that puts Leeds amongst the likes of New York, Paris, Melbourne, Tokyo, Rio de Janeiro and Cape Town in their annual A-list for the second consecutive year. So only 13% of those 900 cities on that list got this A grade that Leeds have got. And they've done massive amount of work in reducing the district's annual greenhouse gas emissions, and it's decreased 38% since 2005. These are really good news stories. They're not the only people. Wandsworth Council are also on that list of 119 towns to receive an A rating. So, you know, well done Wandsworth there. And that's the second year running that they've achieved the grade. And they're just one of 4 local authorities in London to do so. So lots of really good work going on from the point of view of climate change. And this is the sort of work that local authorities can do when they are properly funded. So it's key really that we have proper funding for local authorities, not just to avoid them being cut down to delivering statutory services and taking away some of the valuable other services that they deliver at the moment, but this is about the future look as well as the now, and building a sustainable future. So there is obviously a chance for the public to make their views known at the ballot box in 2024. However, this brings a separate set of concerns for local government. Helen.
Well, yes, certainly in terms of delivering an election. Now, I was reading an article in the Local Government Lawyer the other day in which it discussed a letter which was sent by Clive Betts MP, who's the chair of the Cross-Party Levelling Up Housing and Communities Committee, to Baroness Scott of Bybrook, in which he poses a series of questions. Because in it, he expresses deep concern about the government's implementation of the Rest of the Elections Act 2022 and the impact that would have on the recruitment of electoral registration officers. Now, Clive Betts pointed to the Electoral Commission's assessment of the new requirement for voters to bring photo identification to polling stations. And that showed that 14,000 people were recorded as being unable to vote as they lacked acceptable identification evidence, although the Commission believed the actual number to be far greater. Now, he said in his letter that the Commission had confirmed in their own letters to the committee that it believed 4% of people entitled to vote last May did not try to do so because of this new requirement, which is equivalent to about 740,000 people. Witnesses who appeared before the committee had expressed concerns that the impact of the photo identification rule could be even higher at a general election, which tend to have higher turnouts than local ones. So within the letter, Clive Betts states that, I'm going to quote him here, several returning officers have raised concerns with us about the recruitment and retention of electoral staff. Whilst a long-standing problem, we have heard evidence these issues have been exacerbated with the rollout of voter ID. At the local elections, we heard evidence that many authorities with elections relied on borrowing staff from neighbouring authorities to support them. The Electoral Commission's report concluded administrators were only able to make these elections work by exceptional efforts and commitment. Now, in a general election, local authorities will not be able to rely on those additional staff. Subsequently, the committee is increasingly concerned about the impact this may have on their ability to deliver a safe and secure election, when voter ID will be rolled out on a much larger scale, and many authorities, particularly those in Scotland and Wales, will be undertaking the challenge for the first time. So he asks the government if they've conducted a review of electoral teams to assess their capacity to deliver a general election effectively and securely. Now, I know, Deborah, that this is a concern which is being expressed to us by our members, isn't it?
It is very much so, and indeed we had a session on Friday on our governance conference having a look at the elections 2024 and just what members may well be facing. Now, you don't have to be a lawyer to be a returning officer, but it does sometimes help. And one of the issues that was being discussed on Friday was with respect to this new software that's being built for online absent voters. Now, this software hasn't been fully tested. At the moment, it's considered that that does create risk, and it goes without saying that the May elections are going to come around fairly quickly. And the intention at the moment is to launch this software without full testing if needs be. So there was a bit of a discussion there about quite what sort of risk that may create and how best that should be handled within local authorities. And that there's also talk of the creation of SPOCs, the single point of contact, which is something a little bit new as well. So there's lots of things coming in. So as well as looking for our SPOCs to boldly go where no one has gone before, we have an election which is going places where we've never been before. So we're hoping that many of you will take the opportunity to join us at the elections conference that we're running on the 1st of March. In the words of Boy Scouts and Brownies, be prepared. Changes are coming your way that you will need to deal with. Now, we all know that being an in-house lawyer isn't easy, particularly being a local government lawyer isn't always easy. Now, this is something that's been recognised by our regulator, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and they spoke about a consultation that they're undertaking at present with respect to producing guidance for in-house lawyers, in particular when faced with ethical dilemmas. Now, we were obviously able to give them a good selection of ethical dilemmas that are being faced regularly, and in particular we looked at things like the political interface and the impact they may have on ethical dilemmas, and also something that Helen was talking about just a moment ago, funding issues and having to make stark choices. Now, we would encourage you all to get involved in responding to that consultation, and details for that are on our website. Now, obviously, well-being and mental health are a great concern for us, firstly with respect to our members, and then indeed for the communities within which our members work. Now, the pandemic brought about particular concerns with respect to mental health and children. So, Helen, what news on that front?
Well, something really troubling me, Deborah, and again, the LGA have been examining this, is the fact that the number of children with mental health problems seen by social workers has surged by a quarter since before the coronavirus pandemic, amounting to nearly 1,500 children presenting to councils every week. Just last month, the COVID inquiry heard that children were disproportionately affected by pandemic policies, with their voices not listened to and no one made responsible by the government for ensuring their legal rights were met. Now, reported in The Guardian, questions about how lockdown policies affected young people weren't even asked, according to barrister Jennifer Twite, who gave evidence on behalf of Save the Children UK, Just for Kids Law and the Children's Rights Alliance. Twite went on to say that, quote, "We fear that the answer does not simply lie in the erratic decision-making and the failures of Mr. Johnson or the distractions of Brexit. Although we accept those are unlikely to have helped, instead young people fell foul of systemic failings," she said. Now, if we take a walk back to June this year, the Local Government Association and the Children and the Young People's Mental Health Coalition published a review of government support for mental health services for children and young people over the previous decade. Now, that review recommended the government should develop a new cross-government strategy on mental health and well-being. It also made several recommendations concerning the way different types of support were currently provided. This included that the government should increase provision of early intervention support through community-based early support hubs. And it argued that the government should ensure that there's a full national rollout of mental health support teams in schools and colleges. And the review further concluded too many children and young people are in inpatient care and were receiving inappropriate supports, and it recommended the government should bring forward its plans to reform the Mental Health Act 1983. Now, at the end of August, 414,550 children and young people in England were in contact with an NHS-funded support. In March, just before that, the Children's Commissioner for England published her annual review of children's mental health services. That looks at the year behind, and that review found that 32% of children who were referred for mental health treatment did not receive treatment. So that's a third of children who were seeking it. So last month, the Department for Education has produced a blog on how they're looking after the mental health of children and young people. And in it, they urge schools to apply for a grant, which has already seen 14,000 schools and colleges claim money to train a senior mental health lead to support children on their role. And that grant funding is still available for application. So I would urge anyone who has any contact with any school to get them to look at that and make an application. But it's extremely sobering, Deborah.
It is indeed, and for those out there that watched Children in Need on Friday night, it's clear to see where the gaps in support are and where private funding is often stepping in to bridge those gaps as well. But it is a bit of an unfolding crisis, and we all need to pay due care to that. So I think On that note, I'm pleased to announce that our update bulletin will resume this Friday, and that next week I am going to be replaced by Dennis Hall once more. So until then, a very big thank you from me for joining us today on the podcast. And it's a goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me too. Have a good